कर्तृभ्यो ऋषिभ्यो नमो नमस्ते नमो गुरुभ्यः Namaste. A very good morning to everybody. Um, Today we arrive at a very intricate problem. The accusation that Vedanta is really a form of Buddhism, that Buddhist thought preceded and influenced Vedanta, and therefore Vedanta cannot be called as an authentic Upanishadic darshana, is the accusation that is made. I'll read out Swami's introduction. Swami says, there are authors of Bhashya belonging to other schools who warn us against believing that this way of interpretation started by Gaudapadacharya is genuinely Vedantic, since it is Shankara Vedantic tradition that has been in existence from time immemorial. Therefore, notwithstanding the proven universality of the method of Shankara's system to the detriment of all other traditions, that would not serve as a clincher to convince us that it is not parading in borrowed plumes so long whose influence over Shankara's Vedanta by so many adverse critics. So, this chapter intends to demonstrate the independence of the Vedanta and the Bauddha systems. In order to understand how they are different, it is first useful to briefly understand the central themes of the two main schools of Mahayana. We will be in a better position to see the difference. The logical foundation of Buddhism is the teaching of Pratitya Samutpada or Paticca Samutpada. It is translated as dependent origination. Notion exists, arises. Because this does not exist, that does not arise. Dependent origination. Basically, it consists of 12 factors making up the links in the 12-fold chain of dependency. They are as follows. First, avidya, ignorance. Ignorance is understood as the primary cause of samsara. Because of ignorance, because of avidya, we form three kinds of volition or samskaraha, the mental forces that bring about action. Here, the three types of samskaraha are discussed. Refer to those that produce the corresponding physical, mental, and verbal actions. There are different interpretations, of course. This is one interpretation. Having volitions as conditions, consciousness enters into a new mode of existence. So, the third link in the chain is consciousness, vijnana. At conception, the samskaras of the prior life cause a moment of consciousness that comes to be associated with a particular embryo. Chandrakirti, the commentator of Nagarjuna, writes that the relation between volitions and consciousness, samskara and vijnana, is like that between the moon and its reflection, or between a seal and its wax impression. In both cases, the second item, that is the reflection or the impression, is numerically distinct from the first, the moon or the seal. And yet, the nature of the second item is determined by the nature of the first. Next, the fourth link in the chain is Namarupa. The term Namarupa is misleadingly translated as name and form. The term here is a collective name for the five skandhas, the physical and the psychological elements that make up a psychophysical complex. This is what is called as Namarupa. So, accordingly, once a moment of consciousness has become associated with an embryo, this brings about the development of those physical and psychological elements that make up a living sentient organism. Next, the Nama Rupa having become infused with life, the six sense organs occur. The development of the full psychophysical complex yields a living organism with six sense organs, each having a distinct sensory capacity. The word for the sense organ is ayatana, and they're usually numbered 12, including both the six sense organs and their respective object spheres. Next, the seventh link. Uh, no, I didn't say the sixth link. The sixth link in the chain is contact. I did finish the sixth link. The sixth link is contact. Contact is just the functioning through the mutual interaction of the sense faculty and the sense object and the resulting consciousness. So this contact, the contact between the sense organ and its object, creates feeling. This is the seventh link in the chain. Feeling, that is a sensation of pleasure, pain, or indifference. So the seventh link is feeling. Desire is produced as a result of feeling. Desire for something desire for something results from pleasurable feeling. Aversion is the desire to rid oneself of something. This results from unpleasant feeling, and so on. So desire is the eighth link in the chain. Ninth link is appropriation, the process of identification regarding something, some factor as I or mine. This is appropriation. Now, there being appropriation, there is the coming into existence of the appropriator. This is the 10th link in the chain, the being. From being comes birth, which is the 11th link in the chain, and with birth follows suffering. These are the 12 factors from ignorance to suffering. How ignorance causes suffering, how there are 12 factors in between, one dependent on the other, giving rise to the other. This entire chain of suffering, it is because this is, that is. If this is not, then that is not. This is the theory of Pratitya Samutpada. So Buddha stated, Yo paticca samutpadam passati, so dhammam passati. Yo dhammam passati, so paticca samutpadam passati. I think I've made it paticca samutpada. Those who see dependent origination, pratitya samutpada, will see dharma. Those who see the dharma will see dependent origination. So it is safe to say that this pratitya samutpada stands squarely at the center of Buddhist thought, not necessarily limited to the 12 linked chain, but also the general principle that all phenomena arise in dependence upon causes and conditions. Everything comes into being only in a relation of dependence upon something else. The teaching of dependent origination is set to avoid two extreme views. The extreme position that there is something permanent, Shashvatavada, and the other extreme that there is nothing that endures, Uchchedavada. The Buddha's view is said to be a middle way between two extreme positions. He taught that while all things have continuity, it is the continuity that belongs to a changing series. Each member of the series is impermanent. A member of the series arises in a condition of dependence upon the previous member, in turn provides the condition for the rising of the next member of the series. This is the middle way of Buddha, a middle way between being and non being, between the extremes of Shashvatavada and Uchchedavada. Now, the Madhyamaka school was founded, consolidated by Nagarjuna. He is dated to about 150 to 250 CE. Nagarjuna took his stand on the principle of dependent origination and developed it to its logical conclusion. Nagarjuna argued that the logical conclusion is essential. Object is said to have svabhava if it possesses its nature in an intrinsic manner, in an independent manner, without depending on anything. There are at least 4 to 5 different shades of meaning to the word svabhava, 3 distinct ontological understandings, 1 cognitive. I will not go into the specifics, but manner, not changing, constant intrinsic nature. But according to Buddhism, all things originate only in dependence upon other things. When A depends for its existence upon the existence of B, how can A be said to have an independent nature of its own? To be dependent, and since everything is dependent, everything is without an essential nature, nisvabhava. Everything is empty of an essential nature. It is not simply shunyavada. Shunya of what? What is it empty of? It is empty of an intrinsic nature of svabhava. So it is svabhava shunyata, not mere shunyata, not that nothing exists. It exists, everything is true, is the svabhava shunyata. It says that everything, all phenomena is empty. Empty of what? Empty of svabhava. So shunya basically refers to svabhava shunya. It is equivalent to nisvabhava, which is the logical conclusion of the understanding of pratitya samutpada. Nagarjuna has used the central teaching of early Buddhism to prove the shunyata of all phenomena, swabhava shunyata, and the followers of Madhyamaka say that this teaching of shunyata is the correct understanding of the middle way because it avoids the extremes of permanence and nihilism. Because if a thing has no real existence, bhava, then its real non existence, abhava, too, cannot be established. So, all concepts such as being, non being, samsara, nirvana are all found to be only relational. The way left is relative to right, vice versa. Now, the other tradition of Mahayana Buddhism is the Yogacara or Vijnanavada. This tradition accepted the Madhyamaka teaching of the emptiness of all phenomena. The followers of Yogacara, however, considered the Madhyamaka too abstract, not sufficiently focused upon the fundamental psychological experience of consciousness. According to the Yogacara, consciousness, vijnana, exists as a series of momentary states, one conscious state arising in dependence upon the previous consciousness state. So, consciousness is a flow of momentary states, each of which is dependently originated. In consciousness, there is neither a subject, a grahaka, nor an object, the grahya. There is just a flow of consciousness. And it is this stream of consciousness which is erroneously divided into a personal subject and an objective world. The truth about consciousness is that it is dependently originated and it is intrinsically free from the dichotomy of subject and object. The Yogacarans call this dependently originated stream of consciousness as paratantra swabhava of consciousness. This stream of consciousness, which is erroneously imagined to be divided into subject and object, this is called the imagined nature, the parikalpita swabhava. And this is the basis of all samsara. Parikalpita swabhava of the consciousness is the basis for samsara. This error has to be removed by practice of meditation. And when the practitioner is able to remove the imaginary subject object division in consciousness, consciousness becomes known for what it really is. That is, a dependently originated flow, empty of the division of subject and object. This is called parinishpanna svabhava. So, while the followers of Yogacara accepted the earlier teaching of Swabhava Shunyata, they were not content merely to deconstruct the world in the manner of the Madhyamaka. The Madhyamaka were concerned to demolish the notion that things have an inherent existence. Whereas the focus of the Yogacara was instead on the dichotomy of subject and object and in apprehending the mediativity of the absence of such duality. As a result of meditative practices, the school of Yogacara developed their fundamental and distinctive teaching of the three natures of consciousness, that is, Parikalpita Swabhava, Paratantra Swabhava, Parinishpanna Swabhava. This Paratantra Swabhava is individual in each person. It is said to be dependent because it arises from the transformation of the seeds of the past impressions, the vasanas that have been deposited in the alaya vijnana, the storehouse of consciousness. And in turn, it replenishes the alaya vijnana with new impressions. So it is individualistic also. It is this paratantra nature, the paratantra swabhava of consciousness that is the basis for both samsara and enlightenment. The erroneous subject object division, when it is removed from the Paratantra Svabhava, the latter is seen for what it really is, that is a non dual flow of consciousness, which is called as Parinishpanna Svabhava. The Yogacara differed from the Madhyamaka not only in their emphasis on consciousness and its processes, but also because Yogacara were prepared to grant the flow of dependently originated consciousness with a more positive ontological status than the Madhyamaka. They are accepting some sort of a swabhava to this flow, whereas the Madhyamaka position was entirely, completely swabhava shunyata, which has led to debates between these two traditions. This is a very basic outline of the system of Buddhism. Now, when we examine the Mandukya Karikas, especially the Alata Shanti Prakarana, we find a good deal of Buddhist terminology, especially that of Yogacara, and a seeming agreement with Buddhist thought. Swami writes this in his introduction to the Mandukya Rahasya Vivritti. He says, we now arrive at a very intricate problem. Gaudapada's work, especially the fourth chapter of it, teems with technical terms, turns of expressions, even verbatim quotations which do not appear to be in keeping with Vedanta, while they quite fit in with Buddhist thought. How is this phenomenon to be explained? Are we to suppose that the writer of the chapter is strongly influenced by Buddhist doctrines, or was himself a Vedantin quite sympathetic towards Buddhism? The question first arrested my attention when Professor Dasgupta's History of Indian Philosophy came into my hands and has puzzled me ever since. In the rest of the book, or at least a big chunk of it, Swami analyzes very closely each instance of the alleged Buddhist influence in the Karikas. There is a fundamental difference between the thought of Gaudapadacharya and that of Buddhism, and it lies in this doctrine of dependent origination, Pratitya Samutpada. The Madhyamaka teaching regarding emptiness, that is Shunyata, is the outcome of reasoning based upon the principle of Pratitya Samutpada. The Yogacara philosophy is centered around the concept of the three natures, the Trisvabhava, where the Paratantra nature refers to the Pratitya Samutpada. Gaudapadacharya's Ajativada, on the other hand, is the outcome of reasoning applied to the teaching of the Upanishads that there is a reality that is unborn, changeless, and non dual, arguing from the premise that the real must be changeless because impermanence would be the consequence if it enters into becoming. He concludes that the changeless Brahman has not actually become the world, and therefore the world can only be an unreal appearance of Brahman. His whole approach is fundamentally different from that of Buddhism, and that remains true even though there are some noticeable similarities in the method of reasoning and the conclusions that follow from that reasoning. We'll compare Gaudapadacharya's Karikas with both Nagarjuna's philosophy and with the Yogacharya's Vijnanavada. Nagarjuna states that if a thing has an essential, inherently existing svabhava, then that thing cannot change because an essential nature cannot undergo any kind of alteration. न स्वभावः स्वभावस्य युक्तः प्रत्यय हेतुभिः sorry न संभवः स्वभावस्य युक्तः प्रत्यय हेतुभिः हेतु प्रत्यय संभव not intelligible. If essential swabhava it is essential, then it cannot arise through causes and conditions. Na sambhavaha swabhavasya yukta pratyaya hetubihi. An essential nature that arises out of causes and conditions, hetu pratyaya sambhutaha swabhavaha krutako bhavet, it would be artificial and does not depend upon anything. Svabhavah kritako nama bhavishyati punah katham akritrimah svabhavo hi nirapeksha paratracha. If something exists in its own right, it cannot not exist. Because the change of an intrinsic nature is no way logically possible. त्वं प्रकृत्या स्यात् न भवेदस्य नास्तिता प्रकृतेरन्यथा भावो न हि जातुपपद्यते. Nagarjuna further says that if a thing has an essential nature, the consequence would be that it would neither arise nor cease. Aniruddham anutpannam ashunyam tad bhavishyati. And towards the end of his Mula Madhyama Karika, without cessation, it would become immutable. Ajatam aniruddhancha kutasthancha bhavishyati vichitrabhir avasthabhihi svabhave rahitam jagat. The jagat would become still, static, and that is not possible. It is not a logical conclusion for the world to become static. And this for him is the premise from where he comes from. We'll Gaudapadacharya's philosophy. is also based on this axiomatic statement that if something does not have an intrinsic nature, it cannot become different. He employs this very same definition of Swabhava. Gaudapadacharya quotes Nagarjuna almost verbatim in the second sentence of this verse. न भवत्यमृतं मर्त्यं न मर्त्यममृतं तथा प्रकृतेरन्यथा भावो न कथंचित भविष्यति. This second line, Prakriteranyatha bhavo na kathanchit bhavishyati, is very similar to Nagarjuna's Prakriteranyatha bhavo nahi jatu upapadyate. That is Nagarjuna's, this is Gaudapadacharya's. The immortal does not become mortal, nor does the mortal become immortal. In no way will an intrinsic nature change. So the second line is very close to Nagarjuna's. Gaudapadacharya also agrees that an intrinsic nature, Prakriti, is to be known as that which is self existent, inherent, natural, not artificial, and that which does not abandon its own nature. Samsiddhiki swabhaviki sahaja kritachaya prakriti seti vijnaya swabhavam na jahatiya. It is at this point, however, that Gaudapadacharya parts company with Nagarjuna. In opposition to Nagarjuna, Gaudapadacharya holds that there is one thing that has a svabhava. On the basis of the Upanishads, he asserts that there is a reality that is unborn, therefore free from becoming. And all the becoming, Maya bhidyate hyetan, nanyathajan kathanchana, tatvato bhidyamano hi martyatam amritam vrajet. If this unborn becomes different just through Maya, not otherwise, if it is really altered in reality, then the immortal would become mortal. And he asks, how indeed will an unborn and therefore immortal entity become mortal? Ajatasyaiva bhavasya jatim icchanti vadinaha. Ajato hyamrito bhavo martyatam kathameshyati. Gaudapadacharya says that there is such a reality that is specifically spoken of in the Upanishads as unborn. If the unborn Atman were to undergo an intrinsic change by becoming the world, it would cease to be unborn, for it would have taken birth by undergoing alteration and thereby entered into becoming. And if the Atman enters into becoming, it would become mortal, that is impermanent. But Gaudapadacharya says this is not possible because, as we have seen, he accepts that a thing that does not change its own inherent nature. Gaudapadacharya not only accepts Nagarjuna's axiom about the changelessness of a svabhava, he also accepts the consequences that Nagarjuna says would result from upholding such a view. The consequence is that nothing would arise, nothing would cease. For Nagarjuna, this is an absurd conclusion because it contradicts all the ordinary vyavahara of cause and effect, of karana karya, and so on. But Gaudapadacharya's intention is very different from that of Nagarjuna's, who is analyzing phenomena to show that they are nisvabhava, svabhava shunya. Gaudapadacharya is not really interested in the ontology of the phenomenon of the world. His ontology is with cosmological. It is, or rather, with Brahman in that perspective. He is dismissing the world in toto from the standpoint of Brahman by applying the logic of Swabhava to Brahman. His concern is to show that Brahman does not actually become the world, given that Brahman has the Swabhava of being Aja, unborn. Since the world has not originated by the way of a transformation of Brahman, but given the fact that there is an empirical world, the world origination must only be an appearance. Therefore, Gaudapadacharya says that from the level of ultimate truth, the world is a cosmic illusion. When he says, Swapnamaye yatha drishtam, Gandharvanagaram yatha, tatha vishvam idam drishtam, Vedanteshu vichakshanaihi. Like a dream and a magic or magic is seen, the mirage city that is seen in the sky, so is this world seen by those who are well versed in Vedanta. न निरोधो न चोत्पत्तिर्न बद्धो न च साधकः न मुमुक्षुर्न वै मुक्त इत्येषा परमार्थता. This conclusion about the ontological status of the world seems identical to the understanding of Nagarjuna and other Mahayana Buddhists. Yet there is one important difference that must not be overlooked. The Madhyamaka arrived at their conclusion about the unreality of the world from the application of the central teaching of dependent origination. Things are dependently originated, therefore they are without an inherent nature, nisvabhava, svabhava shunya, and therefore there is neither real origination nor real destruction. Gaudapadacharya arrived at the same conclusion about the nature of the world, namely that it is only apparently real, by applying Nagarjuna's own reasoning about Swabhava to the unborn Brahman. But though the Madhyamaka and Gaudapadacharya have the same or at least a similar understanding about the ontological nature of the world, they have diametrically opposite starting points, and as a result, their final worldview remains very different. Nagarjuna's central teaching is dependent origination, whereas the central teaching of Gaudapadacharya is the changelessness of Brahman, of being itself. Therefore, although the Buddhists and the Vedantins seem to have similar or seem here to be similar, there's a very significant difference between them, because the Vedantin unequivocally affirms that there is a permanent substratum underlying the world of appearance, whereas for the Buddhists there is no such thing. There is only the dependent originated appearance itself. It has long been thought that Gaudapadacharya plagiarized Buddhist teaching because of the close similarity that exists between Gaudapadacharya and the Mahayana Buddhism concerning the nature of the phenomenal world. Not only the later Advaita Veda, so not only the later Vedantins like Bhaskaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Yamunacharya, etc., have criticized this point, but also very ancient Buddhist scholars as well. The Buddhist scholar Shantarakshita, an 8th century Buddhist scholar, cites Gaudapadacharya's shloka word to word, and he writes with some indignation, what they have stated has already been stated by Tathagata. But Shantariksha's objection is misplaced because Gaudapadacharya's teaching only resembles the Mahayana, since Gaudapadacharya nowhere abandons the Upanishadic ontology of the changelessness of being, whereas Nagarjuna arrives at the non origination by rigorously cutting a middle path between what he sees as the extremes of being and non being. To say that Gaudapadacharya may have been inspired to formulate his teachings in the way that he did under the influence of Nagarjuna's own presentation of what it means to have Swabhava is also very, very questionable. We clearly have the Gita verse, Na sato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate sataha. It is possible that Nagarjuna borrowed his axiom from what was already current in that milieu. And so we should be wary of saying that Gaudapadacharya simply borrowed the idea of the changelessness of Swabhava from Nagarjuna, who developed it without any context at all. It is sometimes said that Gaudapadacharya borrowed the doctrine of two levels of truth from Nagarjuna. First of all, Gaudapadacharya did not argue for a two-level hierarchical truth, but only two empirical standpoints of Vyavaharika and Paramarthika. Without getting into the intricacies of this teaching, we can still say that the two standpoints is adopted in the Upanishads also. So it is not something new that is there in Buddhist philosophy. So while Gaudapadacharya's own presentation about the nature of ultimate truth, as stated in his Karikas, especially the particular ones where the phrasing is similar to that of Nagarjuna's. When the phrase looks very similar to that of Nagarjuna's, it may well have been found inspired by what he found there, but the ideas are not new, nor are they borrowed from Buddhism. It is there in the Sampradaya itself, is the is the point. We'll look at Gaudapadacharya and the Yogacara as well. There are a number of instances in the fourth book, Prakarana, where Gaudapadacharya's ideas resemble those of Yogacara, so much so that it has now been believed that Gaudapadacharya was a follower of that tradition. It is undeniable that there is the terminology of the Yogacara that is used. At times, he argues in a very similar manner when he says there is nothing external to consciousness, but there is a major distinction between Yogacara and Gaudapadacharya. The Yogacara, as we have noted, accepted that consciousness is momentary. It is continuously arising, perishing in accord with the principle of dependent origination. For Gaudapadacharya, however, consciousness is non dual, motionless, neither arises nor perishes. Since pure consciousness utilizes the term from the Yogacara to show that the world is an appearance of consciousness and it is not something that exists apart from consciousness. But he's also careful to point out that he does not share the aspects of Yogacara's understanding of consciousness. We'll see this in more detail. In Buddhist thought, the terms consciousness, vijnana, and mind, chitta or manas, are used interchangeably. Chandrakirti says that chitta, manas, vijnana, chetas are synonyms. Gaudapadacharya also uses these words, but he invests them with his own meaning and he distinguishes his view from the yoga itself. जात्याभासं चलाभासं वस्त्वाभासं तथैव च अजाचलम avastutvam vijnanam shantam advayam. This is consciousness. Vijnana is defined as calm, non-dual, unborn, motionless, not an object. It has the appearance, abhasa, of birth, the appearance of moving, chalabhasa, and the appearance of being एवं न जायोचित्तम् एवं धर्माजाः स्मृताः एवमेव विजानन्तो न पतन्ति विपर्यये. Consciousness is not born, so the dharmas are considered to be unborn. Those who know this in this way do not fall into error. It is evident that Gaudapadacharya is distinguishing his teaching from Yogacara in spite of a certain similarity of expression. The Yogacara do not accept that consciousness is unborn or motionless, but Gaudapadacharya explicitly says that this is how it is. It only appears to have an origination, etc. Yogacara accept that consciousness actually has the false division of subject and object, etc. That must be removed through yogic practice. Gaudapadacharya says it does not really have such division. These are unreal appearances in consciousness, which is by nature calm, non-dual, unborn, motionless. So the duality of subject object is appearance for both Yogacara and Gaudapadacharya. But what is it rooted in? What is the basis, the substratum of that argument is entirely different. Gaudapadacharya then introduces the famous analogy of the firebrand, the Alata Chakra. This example is known in Mahayana literature very famously. The Alata Chakra, which is a firebrand, if it is spun very fast, it creates the illusion of a fire circle of fire. If the firebrand is circled very fast, it looks or appears as if there is a circle of fire. Shighra Vritter Alata there. anvaya pratighatini chakrabhantim drishadhatte. But in reality, this circle of fire is really an illusion. It is not real, it is transitory, illusory. Gaudapadacharya is using it here to explicate his own view. He says that just as when a firebrand is whirling, it appears in various patterns. In a similar way, consciousness seemingly vibrates as the perceiver, the grahaka, and the perception of object grahana. When the firebrand stops moving, the appearance of the pattern ceases. So too, when consciousness stops moving, the appearance of subject object also ceases. So when the firebrand moves, the patterns do not come out of something other than the firebrand, nor when the firebrand stops moving do the patterns merge into something other than the firebrand. The patterns do not exist apart from the firebrand because the various appearances cannot exist independently. They are not substances in their own right. The whole idea is that the appearance of the patterns is nothing other than the movement of the firebrand, appearance of the movement of the firebrand, appearance of the patterns that have no reality other than that of the firebrand itself. In a similar way, the appearance of the subject object is nothing but the appearance of the movement, the seeming movement of consciousness. Consciousness does not itself move, it is only an appearance, and from it is created the appearance of the world. It is even possible that Gaudapadacharya used the same illustration of the firebrand to criticize the concept of causal relations. The Karya Karana the relation is very, very fundamental in the Yogacara thought as well. That is it. So, in order to criticize it, also he could have used the same example. He says, everything is born from the perspective of empirical existence. Therefore, nothing is permanent. In reality, everything is unborn. Therefore, there is no annihilation. This is what you can call the middle way. The Madhyamaka interpretation of the middle way would be that because everything is dependently originated, there is the avoidance of the extreme view of annihilation. Because everything is shunya, swabhava shunya, there is the avoidance of the extreme of eternalism. Gaudapadacharya restates the doctrine in his own way, reverses the two terms. He says that according to the perspective of everyday life, when things are born and they die, there cannot be anything eternal. But as everything is really born, there can be no actual annihilation of anything. From the standpoint of the Vyavaharika, things exist as they do according to common sense realism. From the standpoint of absolute truth, things appear as they do to exist. Those do not truly exist because only the unborn Brahman exists. Now, some notable scholars like Das Gupta believed that the Karikas contained sufficient evidence to support the conjecture that Gaudapadacharya was possibly a Buddhist, considered that the teachings of the Upanishads tallied with those of Buddha. T.R.V. Murthy expressed the same view but restricted it only to the Alata Shanti Prakarana. Matilal, on the other hand, placed the issue in maybe a little better perspective. He wrote that under the influence of Buddhist doctrines and arguments upon Gaudapadacharya is undeniable, it would be wrong to conclude that he was a Buddhist. More recently, some scholars have begun to notice some important discrepancies between the teachings of Gaudapadacharya and those of Nagarjuna. Um, Bhattacharya is a scholar that Swamiji notes as well, who, in his very influential work, the Agama Shastra of Gaudapadacharya, he demonstrated that there exists a very close relationship between the Karikas and a variety of Mahayana texts. But he has overstated his case. While there are the textual correspondence, but they are quite tenuous, and he fails to see that there could be differences between the ideas expressed in the same words. The Vedantins and Buddhists share a great deal in common, but the philosophical difference between them ultimately comes down to this important point. For the Vedantins, consciousness is changeless, cannot be confused with the changing cognitions, whereas in the history of Indian Buddhism, the dominant view is that consciousness, like everything else, is subject to dependent origination, momentary, therefore impermanent. TRV Murthy depicts this divide when he says that the former is substance view, in that it maintains that there is a real underlying self that is unchanging consciousness, whereas the Buddhists have traditionally taken the opposite position. The different understanding about the nature of consciousness in the final analysis, the principal philosophical difference between the two tradition, and it is highly unlikely that Gaudapada Acharya, who was keenly aware of the intricacies of the Upanishads and Buddhist thought, could have ignored this fundamental difference in the way that the scholars have posited it. It's not just the modern scholars, it's scholars starting from 8th century, 6th century who have accused or have found the so called superficial similarities between the texts. Parts of Gaudapadacharya Karikas are definitely enigmatic, especially the latter part of the fourth chapter. It is not surprising that it is. See, also the fact is that the fourth chapter is not very often quoted in the Vedantic tradition as well. It has largely not been quoted. So this has also given rise to the suspicion that it may be Buddhist in origin. There are so many controversies about the text of the book, text of the Karikas itself. We are not going to be discussing all of that, but the fact that Gaudapadacharya was revered, he was only selectively quoted by the later authors, can be a reason why the fourth Prakarana was not quoted as extensively. But the absence of such terms, especially the reference to the dependent origination, the Pratitya Saputpada, absolute absence of this paradigm, which is so central to Buddhist thought, coupled with the acceptance of ideas of Swabhava, etc., leads weight to the view that Gaudapadacharya is teaching something entirely other than Buddhism. In the fourth chapter, especially, but although occasionally in the other chapters, he presents the Advaita Vedanta using certain terminologies that is found in the Buddhist texts, but he has redefined the same words. Although the words are the same, but the definitions of the same words is completely different in the Karikas and completely different in the Buddhist text. It does not mean the same thing. So he has used them in such a way that they conform to the fundamental Vedantic understanding of consciousness. So rather than to say Gaudapadacharya reformulated the Upanishadic teachings, Gaudapadacharya stated the Upanishadic teachings in certain different terminologies that were found in that context, maybe that milieu. So see, that he should be stimulated by the words is not so extraordinary given the influence, the dominant influence of Buddhism at that particular period of time in the early centuries of the Christian era, the Common Era. There were numerous monastic institutions. There were some of the very great giant intellectuals, including Nagarjuna. You have Aryadeva, Sangha, Vasubandhu, etc. So the terminologies might have been current in that particular time, but the ideas that Gaudapadacharya is expressing is certainly not Buddhist and certainly belongs to a very ancient sampradaya. So Swami in through with utmost thoroughness has delved into the nuances of the differences between the philosophical systems of Gaudapadacharya and Buddhism. His exposition on this subject is definitive. He has considered every view, the modern view, the controversies that were, or uh, the alleged influences that has been pointed out by the traditional scholars of the Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, etc. He has been very thorough. He presents his arguments very thoroughly. I have only given a very brief outline of the arguments. This is primarily found in Mandukya Rahasya Vivrutti. Very eloquently articulated, very insightful analysis of the topic. Swami demonstrates that Gaudapadacharya's philosophical framework is in no way indebted to Buddhist doctrines. It is rooted in an ancient lineage, the ancient sampradaya of Advaita Vedanta. With this we arrive to the conclusion of the week-long exploration of Swami's profound work of ShuddaShAnkaraprakriyABhAskaraha. In this work, he has elucidated the distinguishing characteristics, the unique characteristics of the Shankara Prakriya. And this uniqueness lies only in its continuation of the lineage of the Purvacharyas. Swamiji has deftly identified the deviations that must have arisen within the tradition, not out of any malice or any disrespect, but a result of his unwavering commitment to the discovering the truth, his persistent pursuit of the correct method of interpreting the Prasthanatraya texts. Swamiji's deep commitment to understanding the truth, his dedication to the study of interpretation of Prasthanatraya, this is what allowed him to identify certain deviations that have arisen within the tradition. But it is important to note that Swamiji's purpose in identifying these deviations was not to criticize or to belittle the correct path. His unwavering commitment to the truth allowed him to conduct a thorough analysis of the Prasthanatraya texts, and he has done so with an impartial mind, seeking only to discern the genuine meaning of the texts. And in doing so, he has been able to differentiate between the teaching of the tradition and the erroneous not a tradition but necessary corrective step that is absolutely necessary in preserving its authenticity, its integrity, ensuring that the teachings are correctly understood, practiced, and transmitted. His insightful analysis has provided clarity, it has provided guidance to those seeking to deepen their tradition is simply a testament to his commitment to truth, his dedication to preserving the authenticity, integrity of the tradition, certainly not an attack on the tradition. And this is ensuring that the teachings are correctly understood by the future generations as well. And in accomplishing this task, Swami has effectively dispelled any confusion that may have lingered in for academicians from the very basic, from the very like level A to level Z or the last level. He has addressed everybody and has been able to so convincingly present his views. To him, we owe an immeasurable debt of gratitude. With my koti pranama to him, I will conclude this talk. Thank you so much.
Good morning, all. All these 7 days, you have listened a fabulous discourse in English by Srimati Manjushri Hegde on the subject Shuddha Shankara Prakriya Bhaskaraha, authored by Sri Swami Satchidanandendrasarawati of Holenarasipura. This is a unique text, smaller by volume and larger by knowledge, which enlightens the traditional Vedanta Prakriya to be followed for the correct understanding of Shruti Vakyas, as emphasized by Acharya Shankara Bhagavatpada, Acharya Gaudapada, etc. etc. This text has 7 chapters, Kiranas, in which all the features such as Adhyaropapavada Prakriya, the status of this Prakriya, the different understandings by different commentators and the conclusion, etc. etc. Here, Swamiji has exposed the very heart of Shankara before the Jignasu, and the speaker, Srimati Manjushri Hegde, has revealed the same in a very efficient manner in her usual style of fluency. I hope all of you have obtained a clear picture about the Shankara Prakriya as propounded by Acharya Shankara himself. Here, propounded is not a correct word. It should be picture about the Shankara Prakriya as Pratyabhignatam by Acharya Shankara itself. Only Pratyabhignatam is the correct word. I don't know the synonym of that word. On behalf of Krishna Kamala Vedanta Pathshala and you all, I extend a hearty gratitude to the speaker for having delivered an exhaustive lecture on this crucial subject. I also thank all of you for having listened the discourse all these days in this precious morning time. Om Tat Sat.